So this is a paper that I want to talk about, and this is called Thinking Beyond Tokens. This was an arXiv paper from 2025. And again, this is one of these things where people are considering sort of if, it's very similar to that um, Dragon Hatchlings work in that they're thinking about brain-inspired models and then thinking about how to move from that to like higher level cognitive functions like reasoning. So they're kind of getting at the sort of dragon hatchlings idea from a different angle. And again, this is this reasoning step in models. Of course, this is they call it artificial general intelligence, but you could just as well say it's a large language model. In fact, I think they talk about large language models in the abstract. So this is thinking beyond tokens, from brain-inspired intelligence to cognitive foundations for artificial general intelligence and its societal impact. It's a very long title. I'm not familiar with the authors on this, but there are a lot of authors. And so the abstract reads, can machines truly think, reason, and act in domains like humans? This enduring question continues to shape the pursuit of AGI, or artificial general intelligence. And so this has, of course, been a question ever since before artificial intelligence, when people would build automata that would like play chess or something like that. And it would be a very, um, you know, uh, people would think it was a human, but it really wasn't. So it was kind of like, classic problems in cognitive science, like the Chinese room or something like that, where something would generate a response. And you'd have to wonder if it was being generated by an intelligence or if it was being generated, say, by a pair of dice or some other machine. And so this is not new. This is something we've thought about for many years, for a long time. It's very deep in the roots of cognitive science. Despite the growing capabilities of models such as GPT 4.5, DeepSeek, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, V4, and Grok 3, which exhibit multimodal fluency and partial reasoning, these systems remain fundamentally limited by their reliance on token level prediction and lack of grounded agency. So, you're kind of the next token up mentality of these models, or at least their limited capabilities of just thinking token by token as opposed to thinking about frameworks and reason, especially higher order things like reasoning. And then, of course, this idea of grounded agency, which whatever that means. We know what agency means, we know what grounding is, but like grounded agency is, I guess, maybe a kind of a way to deal with agents doing things in a context. This paper offers a cross-disciplinary synthesis of AGI development, spanning artificial intelligence, cognitive neuroscience, psychology, generative models, and agent-based systems. So there's a lot of things in this paper. We analyze the architectural and cognitive foundations of general intelligence, highlighting the role of modular reasoning, persistent memory, and multi-agent coordination. In particular, we emphasize the rise of agentic RAG frameworks that combine retrieval, planning, and dynamic tool use to enable more adaptive behavior. So we know what RAGs are in the group. These are these trainable models, or customizable training models. So we have that component, and that might actually be something that sort of operates within a large language model that provides these higher level capabilities. We discuss generalization strategies, including information compression, test time adaptation, and training-free methods as critical pathways towards flexible domain-agnostic intelligence. So again, this is where we're looking for a type of intelligence that's transferable and not just limited to a certain context or a certain task. Vision language models, or VLMs, are re-examined not just as perception modules, but as evolving interfaces for embodied understanding and collaborative task completion. We also argue that true intelligence arises not from scale alone, but from the integration of memory and reasoning, an orchestration of modular, interactive, and self-improving components where compression enables adaptive behavior. Drawing on advances in neurosymbolic systems, reinforcement learning, and cognitive scaffolding, we explore how recent architectures begin to bridge the gap between statistical learning and goal-directed cognition. So this is where, we're kind of moving away from sort of the traditional models, the statistical models, and we're moving towards these sort of neurosymbolic models and sort of the more cognitive aspects of AGI. And of course, this is something we kind of miss when people talk about super intelligence, or when we talk about anything approaching sentience in models, is that we don't really, people who talk about that don't really think about the cognition of the agent. So, I think this is kind of a nice reminder for that. I'm just thinking about the audience for this, and, it may be obvious to our group, but maybe not to everyone. Finally, we identify key scientific, technical, and ethical challenges on the path to AGI, advocating for systems that are not only intelligent, but also transparent, value-aligned, and socially grounded. We anticipate that this paper will serve as a foundational reference for researchers building the next generation of general-purpose human-level machine intelligence. So that's a very aspirational abstract, a lot of things packed in there. So they're using this idea of AGI. They're focusing on these agentive RAG frameworks. They're also focusing on vision language models. All right, so this has a table of contents. So they kind of go through the historical evolution of AI, AGI, as well as agentic AI. Then, they have this section on understanding intelligence, the logical foundations. So they think about the brain, but they also think about cognitive processes. So in terms of brain functionality, they're thinking about brain functional states, memory, human action systems, world models as sort of these cognitive foundations, and then neural networks. So their definition of world models is basically the cognitive foundations of higher order behavior, I guess. So that's the brain functionality. And then cognitive processes talk about networks and connectomes, and so that they talk about that. Here is the way to bridge biological and artificial systems. Then they talk about models of machine intelligence, learning paradigms such as representation learning and knowledge transfer and knowledge distillation. Also talking about biologically inspired architectures, which we know well. Also symbolic, connectionist, and hybrid systems, and of course the neurosymbolic program, and then explainable AI, which is all part of these different models of machine intelligence. They talk about deep learning and reinforcement learning, and then AGI capabilities. So you have your core cognitive functions, which are reasoning, learning, thinking, memory, and perception. You also have your human-centered foundations, your societal integration, and then they get into the thing about vision language models and agentic AI in the context of large language models. And so then they propose that the vision language models and agentic AI are pillars for the future of AGI frameworks. So they really focus on those two things. So then they just kind of finish up and talk with benchmarks, and they talk about future work. So this paper, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I think it has a lot of interesting material in it. kind of laying out some points to revisit, kind of actually kind of maybe weaving together a lot of the buzzwords that are very common now into this cognitive framework. So they talk about post-training strategies as sort of a, we talked about model reasoning earlier in the meeting. This is something that takes us beyond the next token approach to model output. So you have your next token predictions, and you use post-training strategies to introduce reasoning. So of course you can use things like RLHF or other types of approaches, but they also are limited to this sort of same autoregressive framework that the next token approach is. So, we have to keep that in mind. So, just the state of the art right now, we're still limited by our abilities to generate things that are what we might call open-ended and compositional. So we're looking for things that are open-ended and compositional, meaning that on the one hand, we want things to evolve outside of sort of a framework. So if we're constantly using autoregression to improve our model, we're not really looking at the larger picture of the world. So like your model interacts with training data, things are consistent with that training data. It's always going to be in that world. And then an open-ended model might be where it considers a larger context or other possible trajectories. And then, of course, compositional is where your answer is put together in a way that combines different reasoning steps or different maybe cognitive functions, as they'll get to later. So then, they point out that further scaling will not lead to AGI. You can't just scale these tools up. You need to have these fundamental shifts in how we approach this. So that's no news to us, of course. We've talked about neurosymbolic models. We've talked about world models and all of that. So these are things that are fundamentally different from sort of the state of the art that we have now. I mean, people are working on world models, but we're in very early days of that. They have this quote in here. Rodney Brooks in 2008 argued that intelligence emerges from physical embodiment rather than abstraction alone. And so again, if we just use things like chain of thought, tree of thoughts, or other types of trajectory modeling, we're limiting ourselves to this abstraction, and we're not taking into account physical embodiment. Okay, so this is, and then going through sort of the historical evolution of AI and the overview of HGI, and kind of the things that we have to keep in mind moving towards what they want to move towards in this paper. This is an interesting figure, a timeline of key milestones towards artificial general intelligence from 1950 to 2025. So their history of things here. Let's take a look at that because I think it might be quite interesting. So in the 1950s to the 1970s, you had these early foundations, which they define as the Turing test, which we talked about, the Dartmouth workshop, which was a place where they sort of did the formative work, and that was all kind of leading up to the perceptron and ELIZA, and then later on this idea of backpropagation. So there were a lot of things that kind of were formative to the kinds of things we do now. In 1972, we had the first rule-based expert systems. This was Myson. And then, of course, those rule-based systems were very common throughout the 70s and 80s, and then eventually kind of fell into disfavor. Actually, they were used up until, I think, the 2000s, but, for different applications. So they stuck around for a while, but of course, they were found to be limiting for reasons that we've talked about in terms of like sort of the rise of statistical learning. Then, of course, in 1985, we get Bayesian networks. In 1988, we get convolutional neural networks. In 1997, we get IBM's Deep Blue, where this was the point at which Deep Blue was able to beat Garry Kasparov, Kasparov immediately turned around and started to figure out ways to sort of use computers to his advantage. So, we start to get hybrid chess, which of course is, or what they call chimeric chess, where you have humans and machines working together to sort of play chess in an optimal way, drawing on the strengths of each. Then in 2006, you get deep belief networks. In 2012, you get AlexNet. And then, like, this next 15 years is like the majority of this timeline, which is, there's been a lot of stuff in the last 15 years, but I think it gives a short shrift to this earlier period and sort of the historical roots of some of these methods. But this is a good timeline, I think, especially for the latter period here, where you have all these models that are kind of plugging in to this space. And then instead of just being this cacophony of models, we actually can look at sort of how one model enabled the next model. It would have been nice if they would have classified this timeline into different types of models and how they kind of evolve according to separate trajectories, so like the large language models versus some of the other models. But yeah, this is nice. They have the Nobel Prize in 2023 in physics and chemistry that was awarded for AlphaFold. So that's where we are. And then of course, AGI is a question mark, which of course is, that could be way out on the right hand side here. So there are a lot of nice figures in this paper. They kind of a lot of conceptual figures. This one here, this figure section A, is where you have types of intelligence with brain center, whatever that means. Basically, it's like different types of intelligence. So you have technological, interpersonal, visual, logical, kinesthetic, naturalist, musical. So basically, all these different forms of intelligence. If you go to the literature on multiple intelligences, Howard Gardner wrote a book a long time ago about multiple intelligences, or it was called Multiple Intelligences, where they kind of draw out these distinctions between the different types of intelligence. So it's just basically different types of expertise, but also different types of sort of aptitudes. So some people are very good at visual learning. Some people are very good at technology and so forth. And sometimes that's developed through expertise, but sometimes people have sort of an innate aptitude for things. So, and we still don't really understand how that works, but we do have to think about this for general intelligence purposes, that there are many intelligences. And if you're dealing with a general intelligence, do you build one that has all of these attributes, or maybe one or two of these attributes? And then you have a bunch of agents with different types of attributes. And then that's your general or your super intelligence. I don't know. It's interesting. Then you have this figure here, which is a survey of, I guess, practitioners. How far are we from AGI? And there are a variety of answers, the largest category of which is that we are 20 plus years out from AGI. It's 37% of respondents. 3.6% of respondents say that we're 1 to 2 years from AGI. And then the rest of the people, I think, believe that we're from 5 to 20 years out from AGI. So I always find this category fascinating, because who are this 3.6% of people? These are like the true believers, but also people who aren't very good at like extrapolation. So you have these learning paradigms in AGI. So when we talk about AGI, it's different from thinking about AI in terms of as an intelligence, because you have a general aspect to it. So you need to have a lot of components to a general intelligence. So we have 8 things that they propose here. So in you have these 8 learning paradigms, the first of which is continual learning, where you need to learn sequential tasks, where you need to have knowledge preservation over real-time cognition. The next is supervised learning, where you have labeled data sets and known outputs. You also have supervised learning or self-supervised learning, which is feature extraction and robustness. Their self got cut off here. Then you have contrastive learning, which involves similarity metrics and dissimilarity metrics. You have meta-learning, which has prior experience and rapid adaptation. You have semi-supervised learning, which includes efficiency improvements and accuracy enhancement. Unsupervised learning, which involves pattern detection and structure discovery. And then finally, reinforcement learning, which involves environmental interactions and reward optimization. So we have all these different forms of learning, and they all kind of have to fit together seamlessly. And as we know, if we combine like modern reinforcement learning with contrastive learning or reinforcement learning with continual learning, those are very hard to sort of integrate into a single model. So what we're looking at is trying to build a model with all these different types of learning that kind of work seamlessly together, which is kind of hard. In any case, we have a lot of different things in this paper. Some of this is just kind of like an overview of current work and trying to illustrate all of the state of the art, which I think is commendable, but of course, I don't know if it gets us any closer to AGI. I just wanted to point out this other paper, though. I'm not going to go through it in depth, but this is from Topics in Cognitive Science. And of course, this is a journal where they introduce current topics in the field, current different types of trendy things. And so they invite people to give presentation or to write papers on it. So this is Dynamical Cognitive Science, Wherefore Art Thou? And this is by Luis Favela and Vicente Raja. And of course, we know these people from our Cognition Futures sessions, where we talked a lot about embodied cognitive science, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science, especially 4E cognition. And so these two authors wrote this paper in Trends, and they are basically revisiting dynamical cognitive science and the dynamical hypothesis and thinking about sort of the evolution of that approach and where we stand with it. So it's kind of like the other paper where we had a discussion on the roots of AGI and how we kind of go forward. And this paper, so this topic revisits and elucidates the impact of dynamical systems theory since the dynamical hypothesis was presented in the 1990s as an alternative to the information processing approaches central to orthodox cognitive science, which means the kind of cognitive science that doesn't sort of include the dynamical perspective. So, it's usually like trial by trial experiments where we try to get mean behaviors instead of looking at trajectories and sort of dynamical unfolding behaviors. The dynamical hypothesis does not investigate cognition as necessitating explanations in computational or representational terms. So in the 1990s, people were developing dynamical cognitive science in response to sort of the cognitive revolution. You had, of course, ecological psychology and Gibson's approaches. We had the approaches of Michael Turvey and J.S. Kelso, who sort of proposed sort of an initial kind of dynamical hypothesis that behavior actually is dynamical, and you can't understand behavior unless you present it in a dynamical fashion. So this is, we're not really worried about computational or representational explanations here. We're just interested in how behavior unfolds. This has interesting implications for AGI because AGI assumes that there are many different types of learning, but doesn't necessarily assume that behavior can unfold in sort of a generative way, which is interesting because that's kind of the point, say, of a lot of large language models, that they are autoregressive, meaning that they have this trajectory that they constantly are trying to be consistent with, and they have this generative aspect where they're generating answers, maybe probabilistically. In dynamical cognitive science, it's usually based on previous context or the environment, but I think it's probably more consistent than we would like to think. Anyways, instead, dynamical systems theory is leveraged to approach cognition in temporal terms. So dynamical systems theory is all about the temporal flow of behavior, about the continuity of behaviors, how behaviors enable other behaviors, and how that can self-organize into larger structures and more complex behaviors. And so this is often a way to encompass brain-body environment systems, meaning that we have the brain and we have intelligence, but intelligence is often conditioned on the body and environment. So everything is inherently embodied, everything is inherently embedded in its ecological context or its environment. The contributions collected here examine DST's experimental, methodological, and theoretical roles across such areas as informatics, linguistics, and neuroscience, as well as philosophy and psychology. They explore how DST reshapes debates about computation, representation, and embodiment, extending from individual cognition to artificial and social systems. Papers address advances in fractality, multi-scale modeling, and nonlinear methods. Fractality being using fractals and fractal methods to explore time series. Multi-scale modeling being different time scales, different spatial scales, and then nonlinear methods being things that allow us to analyze dynamical trajectories. Then we're also interested in applications to behavioral and neural coordination and theoretical syntheses linking dynamics with cultural and symbolic processes. Together, they assess DST's growing influence in a dynamical renaissance within the cognitive and brain sciences, highlighting both its promise in as a unifying framework and its conceptual challenges. So they're arguing that there's a renaissance of this kind of approach, where there was this initial burst of work in the 90s and 2000s, and now people are kind of bringing this to brain science as well as to embodied cognitive science and 4E cognition. So there have been a lot of advances more recently. So additionally, the corpus on dynamic work in the behavioral sciences keeps advancing both in the individual and social realms. This is clear when reviewing advances regarding the application of DST to understanding dynamics of categorization, development of listening to language, second language acquisition, or collective behavior. The conjunction of all these factors emphasizes the timelines of this topic, which means that this is the right time to reevaluate and reassess the importance of DST for the cognitive sciences. So again, really, when we talk about dynamics, we think about dynamical systems in their most basic and general sense, which is as a system that changes some of its properties in time. And so if we think about it this way, everything that has to do with cognition can be understood as a dynamical system. And so this is indeed the intuition motivating the dynamical hypothesis, which was first proposed by Van Gelder in 1995, which is itself a set of more concrete claims. So cognitive systems are dynamical systems by default, and the best tools to study them come from the dynamical systems hypothesis. So that's their position. And I think that's, I think a really good sort of stake in the ground, not only for cognitive science, but also for the study of AGI or the sort of people who propose AGI. if we can understand things like large language model outputs or other types of AI model outputs as dynamical systems, then maybe we can get a better handle on how they behave like cognition, or how they might compare to cognition. So and we've talked a lot about dynamical systems theory in cognition futures, and we've kind of framed this. We know kind of the sort of the history of it and the way people have framed dynamical systems and cognition from that. So I won't get in too much into that, but I think it's food for thought. And it's nice to see that they're kind of putting down the gauntlet once again on that.
Yeah, I was in and out for some of that, but I remember Raja, and I happened to get a message from Amanda at this time when I mentioned that paper. She's like, oh yeah, Raja writes interesting stuff. So um, we might try to, Amanda and I might try to meet next week. We're trying to sort out all this crazy stuff. So we might meet actually Monday, which is around the Devo worm time, just because that's the easiest time to do it at that time.
Yeah.
I don't think that's gonna. It's not a great time for me long term, and also Devo worm proper. But we might talk about that paper and the REGRT paper Monday.
Okay.
So I might try to like record it or something, even internally record it, just to kind of slowly churn up the cognition futures discussion group type stuff again.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
like, I appreciate you mentioning this paper in light of that, and it's cool stuff, and it's sort of it's interesting to see because I still have. I was looking at the old document. I think it's a Google document of the Cognition Futures Reading Group. We're up to like 81 episodes or 81 sessions last time. So
for what? Cognition Futures or?
Yeah. The Cognition Futures, and then I don't even know if we merged that with the cybernetics one or not. But like just the old ways of keeping track of that. So
yeah.
We'll see where things can sort of bloom from this. But it's good to cover that paper and the other one too. I might mention the other one to Avery also. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it for today. Thank you for attending, and see you next week.